Good afternoon, students. Today we are going to cover the topic share capital from the corporate accounting. We'll start with its meaning, then the categories, and leading the categories will complete the share capital topic. What is share capital? Okay, students, you know that for every business entity, in every company, there are shareholders, there are investors, there are ordinary shareholders, right? So the capital of a company, it is divided into small shares, and all these shares, these are the contributions made by the shareholders in a firm, right? Since the capital account cannot be opened for every shareholder in the company, what the companies do is the companies just they club the amount in the share capital account, right? And accordingly, the shares are divided among the different shareholders. There are certain categories of share capital which we are going to discuss right now. First of all, it's the authorized share capital. What is the authorized share capital? This is that share capital, students, when during the making of company, according to the company law, the company requires to mention its share capital in its memorandum of associations, that is MOA, the most important part of the company before registering your company. You know that the company has to issue their MOA and AOA, and how the company will issue its MOA and AOA. All the norms mentioned in MOA and AOA should be in close familiarity with the registrar of the company, right? So what happens if the company will mention its share capital in MOA? It means the company has that much final share capital, and the company can only issue its share capital in the MOA with the permission of registrar. Suppose in future the share capital of the company is increased. In that case, the company must inform the registrar about the share capital, about the current share capital. If the company wants to increase its share capital in the future, the company has to take the permission of the registrar, right? So what is the authorized share capital? It is that share capital or that sum of money which is stated in the memorandum of association, right? The maximum amount of capital which is raised by the company, it is mentioned in its MOA. That is the authorized share capital. The next one is issued capital. This is that capital, students, the capital which is issued by the company for the subscription. Which subscription? That the company invites the investors so that the investors can subscribe into the shares of the company. Which shares? All the shares the company has raised. When the company will raise its shares, it will invite the investors, right? And the investors will subscribe in that shares, right? The next one is subscribed capital. This is that capital, this is that issued capital, students, which is literally subscribed by the shareholders of the company. It is not necessary that all the shares which are raised by the shareholders will receive subscriptions. It may be 50% of the shares are subscribed. It may be 60% of the shares are subscribed. Right? Because it's uncertain. But at least according to the terms, 90% of issued capital should be subscribed generally. Subscribed by the shareholders. Right? The next one is called up capital. You know that when the company invites the public for purchase of the shares, when the company initiates its offers for the shares, the company may not always call up the full amount of the nominal value of the shares. Right? And the subscribed capital that is called up from the shareholders is the called up capital. Right? The capital which is subscribed by the shareholders is the called up capital. The next one is paid up capital. This is that amount which is paid for the shares which are subscribed. The shares which are subscribed, these shares this is that amount which is paid for the shares which are subscribed. If the shareholders working in the company they does not pay on call, they do not pay on the call, then it will fall under the outstanding calls, that is calls of arrears. Right? The shares subscribed by the shareholders, we know that they have to pay for the shares, right? And when there is a call that shares are issued, now you can purchase the shares or you can pay for the shares. When the shareholders do not pay at that time on the calls means at the time when there is calling of the shares. If the shareholders does not pay on the calls, they will fall under calls of arrears. But when the shareholders working in the company, they pay their full amounts, right? Then it is the paid up capital. But when they do not pay on the calls, then it is the calls of arrears. The next one is reserve capital. Now, what is the reserve capital? That is that capital which is reserved aside by the company to be used in the event of winding up of the company. At winding up of the company, you know that the capital is required. So this is a reserve which is kept aside, which the company will use in future at the type of winding up of the company. The next topic which we are going to do is difference between equity shares and the preference shares. First of all, we are going to do the preference shares. The preference shareholders, they are entitled to the preference shares. In the company, the preference shareholders, they are entitled to the preference shares Now, what are these preference shares? Preference share is that one which has some preferential right other than the other shares. The other shares in the list, they do not have preference. They don't have preferential right, but the preference shares, they have two preferential rights. The one is payment of dividend. At the time of payment of dividend, the preference shareholders are paid firstly. Afterwards, the equity shareholders are paid. So this is the very first point. The next point is at the time of repayment of capital, the preference shareholders are given preference. They are given preferential right over the repayment of capital. Afterwards, the equity shareholders are paid, right? So we'll discuss in little detail. A preferential right with respect to the dividend declared by a company. Such dividends can be at a fixed rate on the nominal value of the shares. In this, the dividend is first paid to the preference shareholders before equity shareholders. Okay. And when it comes to the repayment of capital, in case of liquidation or any other event, then the preference shareholders get paid out first, then the equity shareholders. Other than these two rights, which two rights other than the payment of dividend and the repayment of capital? The preference shares are just similar like equity shares, right? The holders who are working in the company, the holders of preference shares, they can vote in any matters directly affecting their rights or obligations. It means their rights and obligations are not affected at all. Right? Then we have so many types of preference shares. Then there are preference shares which can be redeemed. And there are some type of preference shares which cannot be redeemed. Some of the types are they can be participating. Right? That after the profits are paid out, then still they participate. Then there are some of the preference shares which are non-participating. Right? Then there may be some arrears in demand. Right? Then there may be some non-cumulative. The next topic which we are going to do is, we have done with the preference shares now. And now we are going to do the equity shares. So these equity shareholders who holds the equity shares of the company, they are paid after the preferential shareholders. Right? These equity shareholders, they are also known as ordinary shareholders. These equity shareholders are the ordinary shareholders in the company. But the holders of preference shares, they have some preferential right over the things, over the rights. Which rights? Only two. That is the payment of dividend and repayment of capital. But when we talk about the equity shareholders, they are paid after the preference shareholders. These equity shareholders do not enjoy any preferential rights in the company. They just only enjoy the equity, that is the ownership in the company, that they are the owners of the companies. and the dividend out of the profits given to the shareholders is never fixed. What the board of directors decided for the equity shareholders, that is given to them. They are paid out second because their dividend can be adjusted. But preference shareholders have preferential right over the dividend first. Their dividend is not adjusted at all. So the owners of the company, right? The equity shareholders who enjoys the ownership of the company, they are paid after the preference shareholders. And if suppose in a given year there is no dividend, okay, and at that time these equity shareholders, they may lose the dividend for that year too, and it does not accumulate if they lose the profits or dividend. As the preferential shareholders, they have proper voting rights, the proper rights and obligations in the company. In a similar way, the equity shareholders, they also have, right? So all the equity shareholders working in the company, they have full voting rights in the company. The next topic which we are going to initiate is issue of shares. As we have talked about the share capital, you know that the share capital is that capital which is issued at the time of registering the company, and it is mentioned in the memorandum of association, right? So in the similar way, now we'll be learning about how the shares are issued. You know that I've told you right now that the shares are issued to the public, to the investors, right, or to the people outside the company, and that initiate when the company issues its shares to the public. To initiate that issue, there are some procedures and regulations that we have to follow according to the Companies Act. Right? So we'll be starting its procedure of issue of new shares. When the new shares are issued, what is the procedure? First of all is the issue of prospectus. The prospectus is maintained before issuing of shares, right? The prospectus is basically an invitation which is given to the public so that the public can come and they can subscribe to the shares of the company. And this prospectus is a type of book of some pages which contains the information about the various shares issued at the time. Regarding what is the information in it, the information in it is regarding the shares which are invited to the public, right? This prospectus contains all the information of the company, because you know that before investing, every investor, every public, every person needs to know the financial position of the company. So what the public do is, the public first of all go through the financial structure of the company. The public go through its financial position, its balance sheets, its profit and loss statements. Only then it takes decision of subscribing for the shares. And this prospectus, it contains many of the things regarding the finance. It also tells about the guidelines related to how the capital will be spent So whenever a company is raising its shares for the public, the company needs to issue its prospectus first of all. Because a company cannot just say that I've issued this much shares, I've invited applications for this much shares, and you can apply for it. Because no shareholder will come. No interested investor will come in the company to invest into its shares. Unless or until the public, the investors, they are not aware about the fact that what was the financial position in the last year, how the capital was spent in the last year, the public will definitely not subscribe into the shares of the company, or they will purchase the shares of the company, right? The next one is receiving applications. So first of all, you know that the prospectus was issued. After the prospectus is issued, the prospective investors, then they can apply for the shares, because you know that after the information they receive about the financial position of the company, the investors will only consider the company shares if the company's financial position is good enough to invest. In order to subscribe for the shares, the investors needs to fill an application, right, in the prospectus. Okay. Within 120 days, the minimum subscription has, if the minimum subscription has not reached, then the shares issue will be cancelled. And the application money then will be refunded to the investors. It will not be taken by the company, it will be refunded to the investors within 130 days since issuing of the prospectus, right? Afterwards, not. The next procedure is allotment of shares. So once the minimum subscription has been reached, the shares can be allotted then, right? When the shares are all allotted, it becomes a valid contract between the company and the applicant who has applied for the raised shares. And now the applicant or the investor from the public who has applied for the shares and paid the amount, he or she will become the part of the company. That is, he or she would become the owner of the company according to the various shareholders. The ratio will be divided. Right? And if in case any applications are rejected, any appointments are rejected for the purchase of the shares, the company send the applicants the regret notices, right? The company then can collect the share capital as it wishes in one go or in installments. Okay. So students, this is the procedure of issue of new shares, right? So with this topic is over.